Hello everyone, my name is Hale Curran. Some of you might know me from the Marietta Post Office where I work as the clerk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and about growing up in Marietta. I've written down some stories to share with you. Although I'm now 50 years old, my mind is still pretty good, memory-wise. After all, if one's memory dries up and blows away, you don't have anything left, right? Well, I was born Emma Hale Sykes on April 11th, 1900. Oh, but don't call me Emma. Emma's my grandmother. I go by my middle name, Hale, which was also my mother's maiden name. As I said, I was born in Marietta in a parsonage house on 1st Avenue at the corner of A Street. My mother, Ethel Hale Sykes, died of blood poisoning a week after I was born, so I never knew her. My father, Harvey Sykes, worked for the railroad. Since he was gone for long stretches at a time, he wasn't really able to take care of an infant, me. But he did allow my mother's sister, Katie Sleeper, and my grandmother, Emma Hale, to take over the care of raising me. And eventually, I ended up being raised by my Aunt Katie, and the home I grew up in was the Fountain House Hotel. I have a picture of the hotel right here, share with you. A little bit of the history. It was originally built in 1885 across from the Marietta train depot on Clay Avenue at the corner of B Street. The first owner was Mr. M.L. Wilkes, and at the time he was president of the Temecula Water and Land Company. The original structure was a simple rectangular building. You can see it right here, kind of at the back of the picture. In 1886, Mr. Daniel Buchanan built a grand Victorian-style addition of 13 rooms onto the front of the original building. And he did that for the next owner, who was Mr. Charles Benton. Mr. Buchanan also built the fountain of poured concrete. You can't see it in this picture, but it would have been on this side of the hotel. And that's how the hotel got its name, obviously. Okay. The hotel became known as a mule stop for the California Southern Railroad. The depot, like I said, was directly across the street from the hotel. The hotel would serve meals for the train passengers as well as accommodate overnight guests. Well, my grandfather, Henry Sykes, ended up buying the hotel in 1890. Now, my grandfather Henry was a bit of a wanderer. He never stayed in one place for very long. He was also kind of like Johnny Appleseed, except he planted eucalyptus trees wherever he went, including around the hotel. Well, after about 10 years of running the hotel, and by now it's the early 1900s, he was ready to retire and do something else. So he began looking for someone to rent the hotel and to run it. And that's where my Aunt Katie Sleeper comes in. In 1907, she rented the hotel from my grandfather and became its new landlady. Well, by then, I was 7 years old. My father had remarried and moved to Olive, California. He'd never been a fixed presence in my life, since he was away a lot with the railroad. My Aunt Katie, my mother's sister, was really my parent. Later on, in 1912, my Aunt Katie bought the hotel from my grandfather. Well, let me describe the hotel to you. It was 3 stories tall. 1, 2, 3. It was painted white with just a touch of pink in it and trimmed in chocolate brown. The fountain was on the right side of the hotel, as I mentioned. Steps led to a large porch on the whole width of the front of the building. The front doors were set into an alcove and were adorned with brass knobs and stained glass windows. Well, entering the doors, you would be in a wide hallway with high ceilings and a red patterned carpet. To the left was the office where the guests registered at a three-cornered desk, and to the right was the parlor. Well, while my grandfather ran the hotel, we never went in the parlor unless the preacher came or there was a wedding or a funeral. But as soon as my Aunt Katie bought the hotel, the parlor door was open and we used it. The parlor was furnished in the Victorian style, which meant it had a beautiful red plush love seat and matching chair, a comfortable rocker, and a library table. A heater warmed the room, and an upright piano, which I learned to play, was a natural draw for guests of an evening. The plaster ceiling medallion was cast in a rose design, and the chandelier hanging from it was painted in pale greens and blues. The room behind the parlor was called the back parlor and was used by the family only. It was furnished with a comfortable daybed, chairs, a bookcase, and that's where I kept my dolls and toys. If a bigger room was needed, large rolling doors between the parlors could be opened. Well, stepping across the hall from the back parlor, you enter the private sitting room where my Aunt Katie kept her sewing machine. And again, this room was for family use only. Coming back into the center hallway, the broad staircase to the second floor was on the right. A beautiful cranberry glass chandelier hung at the bottom of the stairs, and there was a closet also tucked underneath the stairs. And at the end of the hallway downstairs, double doors led to a large dining room that spanned the width of the back of the house, or back of the original building, I should say. A huge china closet graced one end of the room and a sideboard the other end. 2 long tables could be put together to accommodate 12 to 14 hungry guests, and there were 2 other tables that could be brought out if needed. 2 chandeliers with frosted shades hung from the wallpapered ceiling. Yes, wallpaper. And the paper was muted shades of greens with gold and yellow roses. Well, the hotel was known far and wide and had a reputation for excellent home-cooked meals served at a fair price. The hotel served 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Meals were 50 cents and consisted of hot biscuits, ham and eggs for breakfast, and for lunch and dinner, roast beef served family style with potatoes, gravy, vegetable, homemade bread, and dessert. And a generous bowl of fruit was the centerpiece. On Sundays, an all-you-can-eat chicken dinner was served for 35 cents. All the bachelors in the country came in on Sunday, and there was no limit to what they could eat. You would think they hadn't eaten all week long. Well, the kitchen was off the dining room through a swinging door. My aunt and I would eat at the table in the kitchen located near the private back stairway. Upstairs on the second floor, there were 13 numbered guest rooms. Well, we had some superstitious guests that started avoiding room number 13, so it was eventually changed to number 18 by adding a few discreet brush strokes. At the back of the hotel, behind a locked door, there were 3 private family bedrooms, and the private stairway I mentioned led from these rooms down to the kitchen. At the front of the hotel, on the second floor, was a door that opened onto a small balcony overlooking the porch. See the balcony right there? Yep. Lovely views of the valley, rolling hills, and distant mountains could be seen from this balcony. Another narrow stairway near the balcony led to the third floor. 5 plastered attic rooms were there, and they were used for storage. When I was little, I would occasionally find Grandfather Sykes up there reading or sneaking an afternoon nap. There were stained glass windows that faced the front of the building, and they repeated the theme of the downstairs entry. A small room over the outdoor balcony had its own windows and clear panes of glass. Well, when I was young, I used to love going upstairs into the attic. I was a curious child and loved to rummage through the trunks and magazines and newspapers. I was also adventurous. My friend Putsy Rimmer, oh, that wasn't her real name. Her real name was Clyde, but everybody called her Putsy. Anyway, Putsy and I used to crawl out, I'll show you, the third floor window, right there, right there, scoot along the edge of the roof, and crawl into the tower window 35 feet above the ground. I don't think my Aunt Katie ever found out. At least she never said anything about it to me. Well, of course, I did help my aunt around the hotel. As you can imagine, running a hotel was a lot of work. Some of my chores included feeding the chickens, ducks, and geese that lived behind the hotel, filling the water pitchers, or ewers as they were called, at the wooden sink out back and carrying them up to the guest rooms, emptying and washing out the chamber pots, and returning them upstairs. We did have a 4-holer privy out back. One side was for men and one side for women. Luckily for me, when my aunt actually bought the hotel in 1912, she had hot water piped into the hotel and a toilet installed upstairs, thus eliminating some of my least favorite chores. The hot water came from a solar heater outside on the back porch. It was a tin box about 6 feet long with a water tank in it. Water often got so hot it spewed out the overflow. My aunt hired a man named Mr. Billy James Boring, and he came twice a year and washed all the windows, cleaned the carpets, and spruced up the place. Oh, by the way, when my Aunt Katie bought the hotel, she cut down all the eucalyptus trees that my grandfather had planted. She did not like them. She felt they made the place too dark and damp and gloomy. Well, my aunt did all the cooking for us and the hotel guests. I remember once she had baked a fresh blackberry pie and had taken it into the dining room to serve the guests. I'll never forget what happened next. When my aunt came back into the kitchen to get the coffee, whoop! Suddenly, there came a piece of pie sliding under the swinging door. 2 guests had gotten mad at each other, so one picked up his pie and threw it at the other. All at once, they grabbed everybody's pie and threw it. Our dining room was a mess, from pie from one end to the other. Well, everyone left, and of course, those who hadn't been in the fight were still covered in pie. The fountain was running outside, so my aunt got a stack of hotel towels, and she took them out, and everybody washed off the pie as best they could, and then they all went to catch the train. Oh well, living across from the train depot made for very interesting people watching when I was growing up. I remember seeing folks arrive by the train on stretchers to go to Gunther's Murrieta Hot Springs. Well, after about 2 or 3 weeks at the springs, we'd see them walk from the bus to the depot as they got back on the train. Some crowds were very polite, but there was often a rough crowd that used to go up to the springs to raise cane and have a high old time, then come back and eat dinner, and then get on the train and go. I remember going home from school for lunch one day. I came past the depot, and here the bus for the hot springs was parked alongside. Well, this old woman was drunker than a skunk. She threw up, and her false teeth came bouncing out towards me. Boy, my eyes were as big as saucers, and I had to run and tell my Aunt Katie all about it. I got home in a hurry. Well, the bus driver picked up her teeth, brought them over to the hotel, turned on the faucet out front, washed off her teeth, and then took them back to her. Another time, I came past the parlor where a rotund woman sat pounding out a tune on my piano, while another sprightly gal, wearing tights with her dress flying everywhere, was dancing around the room. Men were hanging around watching this show, and nobody was eating dinner. I went hightailing it around and reported it to my Aunt Katie. Well, she came in and said it was enough and no more. Well, they got mad, gestured at my aunt as they walked back to the depot, and someone said, "You just lost $20 today." Well, my aunt said she didn't care if she didn't make a cent. She wasn't going to have that kind of stuff going on in her hotel, and she ordered them right out. Well, for the most part, the hotel guests were fine. Sometimes the hotel had a dozen or more people overnight, and sometimes maybe 3 or 4, but it was seldom vacant. We had several salesmen that were repeat guests. One salesman did his bookwork until late at night. My aunt always made sure that plenty of gas was made for the lights. Oh yes, that was another of my chores, making the gas for the lights. The plant was in the back of the hotel. I measured the proper ratios of carbide chunks to so many gallons of water. The carbide boiled and sizzled in the water, and a system of weights clicked off how much gas was available at any given time. It was a huge task each evening to ignite each gas light. I used to love watching the trains go by at night. An occasional midnight cattle train from Temecula rumbled through Murrieta heading for Los Angeles. I'd hear the whistle blow, then get right out to the window and watch the cattle cars go by. They extended down the track as far as the eye could see. The train was a regular part of our lives. It not only brought guests and meals, for meals or rooms, it also brought a lot of everyday goods that we needed at the hotel, like produce and bread, and even the blocks of ice for the hotel's icebox came by train. And the icebox at the hotel had a 600-pound capacity. When I went to high school later, I rode the train to Elsinore for $5 per month. We also rode the train to Riverside about once a week, where I took piano lessons while Aunt Katie did errands. You know, I've always loved animals. I had a dog when I was little that used to bark at my dad when he came to visit on his motorcycle. And at one time, there were 27 cats living at the hotel. When I was 16, I got a horse named Kit. My friend Putsy and I loved to go riding and exploring all over the Murrieta area. I also enjoy photography, and early on had a Brownie camera that I take pictures with of the people around Murrieta. Ooh, which reminds me, I remember in 1913 I saw the first airplane fly over Murrieta en route to Elsinore. I didn't have my camera with me, so I just stood watching it fly by. I regret not getting a picture of that. Did you know in 1915, Washington Avenue was paved to become part of the new highway that went through Temecula and on down to San Diego? Well, that meant the center of Murrieta was no longer around the depot, but along Washington Avenue. Well, lucky for us, the Fountain House Hotel continued to do a good business. Let's see now. Oh yes, I remember the year 1918 especially well, as several big events happened. First, in April 1918, an estimated 6.8 earthquake struck the area. Well, I had just turned 18, but my land, I thought the end had come. I ran to the depot for safety. 3 chimneys on the hotel either fell down or were damaged, and luckily nobody was hurt. But the damage to one of the chimneys will come into play later on in my story. And who can forget that on November 11th, 1918, the armistice was signed, ending World War I. Putsy and I paraded down the street to celebrate. I had a newspaper, and Putsy had the dinner gong we used at the hotel to call the guests to dinner. She was banging away on it, and I was marching along yelling, "The war's over!" We were having a grand old time until a local farmer chided us for upsetting his horse with all our noise. The same month also saw the completion of the grain elevator on Clay Avenue just north of the hotel, adjacent to the railroad tracks. It was made of concrete and stood 80 feet high, much taller than the hotel. I can remember watching breathlessly while a man, one of the workers I assume, performed handstands on the scaffolding every evening when the train came by. Well, on to the year 1921 when, on April 11th, I turned 21. And in June of that year, I received a new Ford Roadster. Goodness, I felt so grown up. I remember looking back on my growing years as a wonderful, long childhood. Sadly, my happiness didn't last long. A few months later, in October, my Aunt Katie's health began to decline. On November 13, 1921, my aunt died at the age of 60. She is buried in Laurel Cemetery here in Marietta, near my grandmother and mother. Suddenly, I was all alone. My father had remarried in 1911 and now lived with his family in Olive. He had never been a steady presence in my life. My Aunt Katie, never having children of her own, raised me as her child. Now she was gone, and I was miserable without her. After all these years, I still miss her. Well, she bequeathed to me the 26-room hotel and all of the animals that were there. Well, I'd never been away from home to work, and now I had to face running the hotel on my own. I had no idea what to do. But if there's one thing my aunt taught me, is you have to stay strong and not give up, even when things look their worst. Instead of living by myself in the hotel, I stayed for a while with another aunt, Hattie Kaufman. Then I moved to Los Angeles, finding work at the B&M cafeteria, which at that time was advertised as the largest cafeteria on one floor in the world. For several years, I rented the hotel to other people, sometimes as a hotel and sometimes as a home. Finally, it was left vacant. Well, while I was living and working in Los Angeles, I met Richard Curran. We got married in 1925. We had 2 children, Marvin, born in 1928 in Los Angeles, and Kay, born later in 1933. Well, now that I had a husband and son, we decided to return to Marietta. The 3 of us moved back in 1931, and the Fountain House Hotel became our home. Over the years, Dick made some changes to the hotel, including tearing down the plain back portion of it, leaving only the attractive 13-room addition built in 1886. Well, as they say, all good things come to an end. And in October of 1935, we experienced a terrible tragedy. The children and I had gone to have supper with our neighbors, the Manses. While doing the dishes, Lillian Mance and I saw lots of cars coming down B Street. "What's going on?" I said. "Is the grain elevator on fire?" Then I realized, oh, it's my place. I left the kids with Lillian while I ran to the hotel. I watched, horrified and heartsick, as a blazing inferno consumed the hotel. Later I learned that the fire had started in one of the earthquake-damaged chimneys. It smoldered for a while and then whoosh! Since there were no fire blocks in the walls, the flames went straight up, eating through the wooden uprights all the way to the 3rd floor. A crowd had gathered to watch, and friends and neighbors were able to save some items like my piano, music cabinet, the china closet filled with heirloom china, a bookcase, some books, trunks, and some pictures. Someone even saved the dinner gong. All of those items were in the downstairs rooms. When some folks started to go back in to bring out more stuff, I said no. I didn't want anyone risking their life for just stuff. Everything in the attic and upper rooms, including some belongings I was storing for friends, was lost. Despite the help of almost everyone in town, the hotel burned to the ground. We only had a bucket brigade and fire extinguishers back then. The closest fire department was in Paris, more than 20 miles away. By the time they were able to get there, the hotel was gutted. The only thing left of the once grand Fountain House Hotel was the concrete fountain. You can imagine how I felt. My home for most of my life was gone. By then, Dick and I were divorced. I had 2 young children. There was no insurance. Our outlook seemed pretty bleak. But the townspeople of Murrieta wrapped their arms around us and began to help. They stored our belongings, cleaned up after the fire, and prepared to build. The kids and I stayed upstairs at the Manses' house so I could be close by during the building of our new home. My Aunt Dovey Sykes drew the new floor plan. Volunteers went to work on the same site as the old hotel. Anyone who could pound a nail came. Lillian Mance cooked hot meals for the workers. By April of 1936, just 6 months after the fire, our new lath and plaster home was completed. Well, for a while before the fire, I had been working at Gunther's Murrieta Hot Springs Resort as a maid. I walked there every day, around 5 miles each way, and made 50 cents a day. Later in 1936, after moving into the new house, is when I became the clerk for the Murrieta Post Office. The post office was originally located in Albert K. Small's store on Washington Avenue and Juniper Street. And even though I earned less money than I did at the hot springs, I didn't have to walk as far. It's only about 3 blocks. My friend Mrs. Rose Tarwater was appointed postmaster in June of 1936. Every morning, I'd arrive early to open the post office doors. On winter mornings, it was cold as a tomb inside. We had an iron coal burner stove for heat, but it was so old and warped, the lids wouldn't seat and the door wouldn't close securely. But it was enough to take the chill off the room and heat the water in the percolator for coffee. Mrs. Tarwater always brought fresh cream from their cows. We'd get donuts from the store next door, and that was our breakfast. I've never tasted a donut since as good as those ones we ate at the old post office. The post office space was a roughshod kind of place, made of worn boards, never painted or finished in any way. The roof leaked, and the rain came right down inside. It was dimly lit with a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was a rickety rocking chair tied with baling wire to keep it together. A small desk with a few pigeonholes was there for writing out money orders and such. Well, Mrs. Tarwater decided that Murrieta ought to have a nicer post office. So on a trip to the annual postmaster meeting in Washington, D.C., she advocated with lawmakers for a new, bigger building for Murrieta's post office. And she was successful. In 1940, Mr. Jack Hamilton, a local carpenter, built a new post office on the northwest corner of Washington Avenue and C Street, right across from his own house. The 700-square-foot building opened July 1st, 1940, was and still is the pride of the community. Not only can you get your mail, you can find out anything about the goings-on around Murrieta by announcements posted on a bulletin board beside the main entrance. Working in a post office, as you might imagine, can be the scene of some interesting experiences, and we've had our share. I remember once when Mr. Hewitt, the mail carrier, arrived from Paris, and along with the mail, a startled cat came out of the mailbag. It was Mrs. Gooch's cat. You know, she runs the Palomar Hotel in Temecula. The cat had crawled in the bag and fallen asleep, and Mr. Hewitt hadn't noticed. Of course, the cat was returned to Mrs. Gooch by special delivery. Oh yes, another thing which happens every year, one of the patrons at the post office, I'm not going to name names, likes to special order hot pepper seeds from New Mexico. They arrive in a cardboard box that inevitably lets some of the seeds out. Well, those seeds are so hot, they burn your skin and eyes just trying to clean up after them. I always try to be extra careful when I see that box arrive, but it always seems to end up with burning my eyes and getting teary. Yeah. Well, I am pleased to say both of my children are doing well for themselves. Marvin is 22 years old now. He recently bought the Associated gas station on the corner of Washington Avenue and Juniper Street. He's already had the old glass reservoir pumps replaced with modern electric pumps. Marvin's also been a volunteer firefighter with Murrieta's Volunteer Fire Department since 1947. In his spare time, he goes up to Los Angeles or over to Catalina Island with his friends. My daughter Kay attends Elsinore High School, where I went to school, except she rides in a brand new school bus instead of on the train. She is active in her 4-H group and recently won a first-place ribbon at the 4-H fair in Hemet for a dress she sewed. And she has just been chosen Murrieta Queen for the upcoming Valley-wide 4th of July celebration. I am very proud of my children. Well, here it is, 1950, and the post office is still one of the busiest places in town. New folks are moving in all the time. I always greet them and make them feel welcome to our wonderful town of Murrieta. My goodness, I've talked your ears off. Thank you for letting me reminisce with you today, and please come see me at the post office. Bye now.